Welcome to the Biotech Startups podcast by Exceeder. Join us as we speak with first-time founders, serial entrepreneurs, and experienced investors about the challenges and triumphs of running a biotech startup, from pre-seed to IPO, with your host, John Chi.
My guest today is Mark Kotter, neurosurgeon, stem cell biologist, and CEO and founder of Bit.bio. Bit.bio is an award-winning human synthetic biology company providing human cells for research, drug discovery, and cell therapy. Bit.bio applies a patented safe harbor gene targeting approach to inducibly express transcription factor combinations that reprogram human-induced pluripotent stem cells into highly defined and mature human cell types. Bit.bio spun out of the University of Cambridge in 2016 and has since raised approximately $200 million from Arch Ventures, Foresight Capital, Milky Way, Charles River Laboratories, National Resilience, Tencent, and Pulau Capital, among others. In addition to Bit.bio, Mark is also the co-founder of Meetable, scientific founder and chairman of rejuvenation startup Clock Bio, and co-founder and trustee of myelopathy.org, the first charity dedicated to a common yet often overseen condition causing a slow-motion spinal cord injury. Mark has also been a professor and researcher at Cambridge for more than 15 years. His diverse experience as an academic and serial entrepreneur offers a wealth of insights aspiring scientists founders can draw from. Over the next 4 episodes, we cover a wide range of topics, including Mark's early years moving all around the world, his time at Cambridge pursuing a PhD in regenerative medicine, his work in synthetic biology and stem cell research, his transition from clinician scientist to serial entrepreneur, and the founding and evolution of his latest company, Bit.bio. Today, we'll chat about Mark's upbringing as a curious child in Canada and his exposure to a broad range of cultures and perspectives as his family moved around for his father's work. We'll also touch on his experiences growing up with dyslexia and how it led him to focus on science and mathematics at an early age. Lastly, we'll talk about his experience as a researcher and PhD student at Cambridge, where he transitioned from medicine to synthetic biology and stem cell research. Without further ado, let's dive into this episode of the Biotech Startups podcast. Mark, it's so good to see you again. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So as we were doing our homework before our conversation, talking to the team, we are, of course, very, very, just incredibly impressed with, your at least the journey that we've seen from the outside looking in. And we thought it'd be a really fun place to start by you just kind of giving us a little bit of background on your upbringing and how it influenced your business philosophy, your leadership style, and learn how you got inspired to pursue science.
Okay, so as you can easily figure out by my accent, English isn't my first language, although I've been born in Canada. So my parents, both Austrian, went to Canada. My father studied there, and I was lucky enough to, become a Canadian citizen by birth. We then returned back to Europe. And my father had a career in industry, so we're hopping around different places, companies, and actually countries. And so maybe one thing that is that sort of differentiates me a little bit is this, from the beginning onwards, locality was one thing, but also moving to new places, getting to know new people, and especially how the same things can be seen from so many different ways. So I can remember growing up in a little town in Germany, and they had very set ideas about things. But I knew whenever I went to see my grandparents in Austria, the same things would be seen in a very different light. So that sort of breadth of, opportunity to look at the world was something that I experienced just because of the different moves.
That's amazing. And, it's funny because when I hear, stories of those who've kind of grown up living in different countries, different cultures, I think back about my lived experience. And it's weird because I was born in Berkeley and I'm now in San Francisco, which is not that far away. So maybe like 7 miles away. And I joke that I haven't left a 7-mile radius. I was born in Berkeley, went to school in Berkeley, and was so adventurous enough to be courageous to go across the bridge and live 7 miles away. So it's amazing to hear that experience. You said your father was in business. Can you talk a little bit about like what it was like, kind of being in that environment where it seems to be kind of like via osmosis, you might be absorbing the learnings of your parents. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, all I knew about my father is that he talks the entire day long in meetings, and that he's never at home. So that's how I remember that. But when he was at home, it was good fun, actually. Um, One thing that was clear is that there was a certain focus on a goal, and he was quite successful in his career. Um, and and I didn't know what success was at that moment in time in a business context. I just saw that there were people running after him and around him, and discussing things that I didn't know about. And then also I was inspired by the family history of which also had, at least on a few occasions, entrepreneurs going back, maybe 150 years or so. And so, whilst I never decided, actually, I actively decided not to go into business at a later stage.
That's
I
amazing.
I always felt, how do people do this? What does it mean to create a company or an enterprise? And it was an abstract thing, for the most part.
And was science always a presence in your life, or was that something that you kind of discovered a passion for later, or was it something that you were exposed to kind of in your earliest days?
I mean, I kind of was a bit nerdy, I would say. So I would be, looking at mainly, animals, and bugs, and sometimes dissect them. And so in school, it became clear that I would be orientating myself towards maths and science, also because I was incredibly dyslexic, so much so that for a period of time, my grades in German were dismal. I mean, really horrendous. It sort of I turned the corner when I became, when I turned 17 or 18, but there was definitely a period of time where, there was more markings in my essay than than actually words written by myself.
And that's amazing because like sometimes that's just like how it is. Like there are these inflection points where it's like, well, I guess I'm doing STEM. Like this is where my strengths might lie. So I'm gonna just pull that thread. So you mentioned that you're 16, 17, and you're starting.
Yeah,
You get an essay back. It's bloodied. You're like, oh God.
exactly. It was more red than blue.
Yeah.
Well, and then, that was actually one of the turning points was exactly around the age of 15, 16, when I decided to go and live away for a year. So I went to Australia, of all places. And that really gave me a lot of freedom, and again, the opportunity to experience something completely different. And coming back, I sort of had a very good idea of what I wanted to do. So I discovered probably my main talent in life, which I've totally wasted, is maths. So, so, so I sort of, comparably, I became very good. So I was in, I was in a small card of, national selected pupils who had additional maths at school. So they brought us all together across Germany, and hothoused us a little bit. And when I then graduated from high school, I decided to do maths and physics. And so, and that's what I did. And then something happened where, and it's probably because I was, in a very provincial mindset, but at that moment in time, 1990, I just didn't know what to do with it. So I had this fascination for abstract thoughts, But at the same time, I had this real, let's say, angst that this might lead to nothing. Eventually, then I'm going to waste my life doing something that gives me pleasure, but no impact. And actually, it was a bit of a hard time then. I had probably what you now would call a depression. So it was pretty existential at that moment in time. And when you don't know anything anymore, and you think you've lost it, then I thought, so how do I get out of this? And so I said, okay, first principles. If you don't know what your place in life is, or your mission, or why you're here, and you have no reference, then what can be seen as good foundationally. And I said to me, well, helping others. And so after a semester or two in maths, I sort of got stuck with this idea of potentially pivoting to medicine, which is not something I planned at all. In fact, I decided to no longer study biology around grade 10. So I didn't have biology for 2 years. And the other thing was that I also, it was such a strange world. So I said, okay, if this makes sense, and it did make sense, I didn't know whether it was for me, then maybe I should try it out. So I became a nurse assistant for half a year or so. And I ended up in a ward for people with spinal cord injuries. And that was I've never seen anything like this before. It's very heavy duty. I mean, they need a lot of care. And it really sort of turned my world upside down. And I didn't know whether that was the right thing or not. So it took me a few months. And then at the end of I decided, yes, I'm going to go for it. So I pivoted away from maths, and then jumped and started to do medicine. So
Wow.
by all means, it wasn't a linear path at all.
That's incredible. And there's a kind of like two kind of, I kind of like quickly kind of just starting to connect dots here. And it's kind of like, it always kind of like surprises me when I hear these stories that there's like these kind of just serendipitous kind of inflection points in one's business journey, life journey that can totally, because obviously I know now, like knowing kind of like looking back, I'm like, how did you that is what you've dedicated a lot of time to, is kind of
my life, essentially.
Your life, right? Obviously. And you're just like, it goes all the way back. Like it goes all the way back to this experience as like a nurse assistant. And I guess before we talk a little bit about that experience, going back one moment to Australia, what was it about Australia? Like that kind of like flipped the switch for you when it's like, math is what I want to focus on, at least in that point in time.
So if you go to another place, you have to, reorientate and find new bearings. And of course, here there was a void. It was just me. There was no influence from outside. I chose maths there because I knew it was relatively easy for me. But I sort of got the chance also on the language side. English is my second language, and interestingly, that meant I didn't experience any dyslexia. So in German I was heavily dyslexic, but my English wasn't affected by it. So it sort of reset everything, and then I learned actually, I can solve this dyslexia thing by treating maybe German as a foreign language in some ways.
Interesting.
And when I came back, it was really just that I don't want to sort of come across um, in the wrong way, but I just felt maths was super easy, and I just was always, at the top. And then there was this, I say, national competition, and they picked. So every school was allowed to send one or two of their best pupils. And then there was, I remember 6-hour test or something like that. And from the hundreds that were there, 20 or 15 were picked. So it kind of tells you that, that is something that you're good at. And I loved it. I really like ordering the world.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that's like amazing to hear, because like, and now I'm like, maybe I should get out of San Francisco and get out of the Bay Area because I'm like, maybe the problems I'm experiencing right now, I'm like, I've been in the same area for too long. Maybe I just need that shock to the system, and just like, maybe that's exactly what I needed, rather than just trying to like hammer away just at like this problem that I've been focusing on for so long. Like, and kind of, kind of fast forwarding a little bit here, it seems that you went from math, and then you decided to like try your hand at medicine. And I guess my first question for you is like, how did this like nurse assistant opportunity even come about? Was it just a simple thing where you're like knocking on doors, or was it like kind of something where someone made an introduction? How did the opportunity arise?
So I knew someone who was doing that, and so I tapped his shoulder and asked him whether he could help. It was an experiment on my side, on myself. Just coming back to what we discussed earlier on, going abroad, actually, you learn more about yourself than location. And I think that is sort of the important thing there. When I then entered the hospital, again, it was a completely strange world. And medicine has completely different set of rules um, and ways of going about. So again, I was sort of catapulted into some unknown territory, being exposed to patients. You come them very close. I remember a young vet that just graduated, and to celebrate their graduation, his group went to Odessa, and he came from Russia, and he jumped into the water, and he broke his neck, and he was paralyzed from the neck downward. So that person was maybe 6 years older than myself, maybe 7. And seeing this and seeing what happened to him, that made a very deep impression on me. And so it's strange, but 25 years later, I end up as a neurosurgeon with a specialist interest in spinal cord injury. And it's not something that I chose knowingly at that moment in time. It's something I was drawn back into this over time.
That's incredible. And like, it's those memories that really get seared into you. And I can very much think about like kind of experiences that like are continue to like seared into me, in just why I'm a lot of my friends are like, you're like, they say they have the blinders on, but I just call it focus. It's like, I just call it focus. But now that you've had this, clearly a very kind of eyes open, awakening moment while you're in school. How did that translate into, so now you're like, okay, we're now pursuing medicine. When you come back from your stint at the hospital, how did your kind of academic career change from there?
So I basically changed to medicine. Also changed from Germany to Austria. Wanted to come back to Germany, but serendipitously, got stuck in Austria. It was a very nice time that I had there. But what was very clear, I was asked the question, how does it work and why? And so relatively early on studying medicine, I knew that I wanted to be exposed with regard in research. And so, I looked for those opportunities as well. It wasn't clear, however, yet the choice wasn't fully baked, because I also had the chance to study music at the same time. And so there was a little bit of, a period of 2 or 3 years where I did both. So I,
Cool.
up 6 o'clock in the morning, played the piano for 2, 3 hours, and then I would go and see some lectures and come back and do my composition and homework, etc. So medicine won. Let's keep it.
Yeah. But that's amazing. Like, and I kind of in a similar vein, while I was at Berkeley studying basically biochemistry, I also was studying philosophy. Had a moment where I was like, I might do the philosophy route, but biology won in this case. But I still take it, like I still very much find that I'm tapping into the kind of like the lessons learned, kind of via the philosophy training. And it's things like that. I love taking inspiration from various industries, various disciplines, because I always think that you can incorporate it into whatever you're focusing in on now.
I mean, nobody can say that you've got blinders on. If you have, these are so disparate subjects. I think, and you're right. You can draw things. Often it's a structure in your thought process or so that you can transfer, and I think it does. Well, I believe potentially gives a little bit of an advantage.
Absolutely. And so while you're studying music, and obviously you ended up getting your medical degree at the University of Graz, I guess my first question is, what inspired you or kind of sparked the interest in research? Because usually they're kind of like separated, kind of like, you're either practicing medicine as like a practitioner or you're in the lab. And, obviously MD PhDs obviously are a thing, but like, was there a moment in time where you're like, this is really cool, I want to do research as well? Or was it something that you were just like, and just like figure it out on your own?
Well, I think firstly, when you learn how the body works, in its across different scales, from the molecular scale to, the body that we see, it's fascinating. Everything's intertwined. And then if you look a bit closer, so little. So there's gaps everywhere. So the question always, the next why or how, there's always a point in time where that fails. You don't get an answer. And I'm quite curious. So I think that's sort of what drove me into, wanting to find out more, wanting to understand how people found out what we now seem to know. And then, of course, also realizing that what people know might change over time. And so, there's this, let's say, even science, there are waves or ways of looking at things, and they come and go, or they just are replaced. So it's not most of the truths that we believe are potentially not as robust as we'd like them to be.
Absolutely. And that is like definitely something I have encountered time and time again. Is you always have to, exactly what you're saying, like checking the why. Like, why do we, like, you peel back the layer of the onion and you just ask yourself why until you get, sometimes you just get to a point and you're like, I get it. Okay, I now understand. But sometimes you pull back the layer and you're just like, huh? And then you're like, maybe we can like reevaluate why we have this world lens, or understanding of this mechanism of action. And so I guess while you're completing your medical degree, were you doing research simultaneously?
Yeah, it was sort of intercalated. So I was able to, join a lab in Cambridge, and did a year or so during my medical degrees. There's another reason, maybe, why I was so drawn to research. Now that we talked about my sort of earlier past. So when you have dyslexia, you actually have very difficult, you've got memory issues, short-term memory issues. So how do you bang the amount of knowledge into your head that you need to accumulate for a medical degree? And for me, it was always understanding cause-effect relationship as far as you can. And so I never learned anything just by sort of memorizing it. Well, it's not quite true. Pharmacological names were, probably the worst thing I had to memorize. And it was just like repeating them 1,000 times,
Yeah.
drumming them into my head. But most of the other times, I realized if I try and ask the why and go to the bottom, as far as we know, actually, it's sort of, I can store it. And maybe the sort of curiosity was a self-help mechanism to overcome
Yeah.
my dyslexia.
Yeah.
I still ask why all the time.
And sometimes
Or
it is
how.
just quite that.
How.
Or
Yeah.
how. Yeah, absolutely. We can't ignore that. And no, I think that was like for me is what kind of got me so fired up about just wet lab research was exactly that. That's the name of the game. It's like just trying to peel back the layers as far as you can, and just deepen the understanding. And so you're doing that. You have a year of research, and I guess maybe my first question is, how did you land that position? And like, can you tell me a little bit about, again, was it an instance where you're knocking on doors, asking friends? Because obviously it is, they're not that close to each other. And also, can you talk a little about your first lab experience at Cambridge?
Sure. So it's a mix of all the things that you said. So I was somehow lucky. I applied for an elective, and this is of course a clinical placement, and I got to be sort of be given that opportunity. So I was doing the ward rounds with the neurologists here, and then I was quite impressed. Very different atmosphere to where I studied, and I was trying to see, how can I get into this? How, it was not only in terms of technologies that you had here, sequencing was a big thing at that moment in time, but also the culture seemed to be different. And so I made friends with a PhD student here. And he said, hey, if you're interested, I can introduce you to my prof. So I basically knocked at the door and I said, look, I'd like to work with you and do some research. And he said, okay, I don't have any stipends or anything that I can give you, but why don't we try it out? So I just pitched up. He gave me a project. We looked at mutations in a metabolic gene, and I liked it. And he became extremely supportive of me, and so that was the entry to the lab. So it was the most, old-fashioned lab that you can think of. It was old-fashioned. It was mid-90s, in the mid-90s, so it looked a bit more like a lab from the 1930s or so.
Yeah.
Bottles everywhere, things everywhere. It was filthy. It was really, it would fit into one of these movies.
Yeah.
But we managed to, look at and identify some unique mutations in this gene, and then my year was up. Um, and then he asked me whether I would like to come back for a PhD, and I said, I'd love to, but not with you. I want to go and work in a neurology lab.
Yeah, yeah.
So I made some intros, and and I got and I was lucky enough to be accepted. So that is
That's so cool though. Like I think, for whenever I have conversations with folks who are deciding to, try to get, dip their toes into wet lab research, sometimes the impression is that it's very procedural and very like, you fill out this form, you do this, you do that, step 1, step 2, step 3. But I think I love hearing what is frankly, it's just like you speak to the PI and you say, can I do some work? Like, can I? And sometimes it's as simple as that. It's I think in this day and age, now that we're hooked to our computers, it can always feel like, okay, I got to fill out the application and do all these things, but people are people still. I mean, you can still just say hello, and see if there's an
it might
opportunity.
have changed by now, but quite frankly, I also, when I look at the people that I recruited, mainly, knowing them, meeting them, being introduced to them. So yeah, I
Absolutely.
think it's people's game.
Yeah. And so it's funny that you're talking about how the lab looked, because I remember like stories just like when you had to mouth pipette, which
exactly.
and clearly
It's
now
really bromide.
clearly now we're like, don't do that, but it was just so commonplace, and you're just like, oh god, well, damage has been done. Like I can't, that's in the past now. So
I remember that, we had our little sink with lithium bromide, it was glowing. And you realize it was crazy.
Yeah, it's so crazy, and just like how far we've come in the in wet lab research today. And something that I'm curious about, you mentioned that the culture was really different when you eventually did went to Cambridge and did the year. What exactly about what was the cultural difference that you noticed, like, and surprised you the most?
So I connected with a sense of curiosity, which and Austria at that point in time was much more procedural. I think it's massively changed, by the way, but at that point in time. And also, the PI that I had in Austria was very formal. So if I wanted to have a conversation, I had to, find a secretary, and then I would be given a slot. And sometimes, it would be in the far distant future. And in Cambridge, I basically called Professor Cox. I just knocked on his door, and most of the time he would, welcome me in, and we'd have a chat about things. So that immediacy of, having access to people that know, and receiving input, and directly and immediately being able to change tack in the lab versus having to wait. So what actually made me decide to quit my lab job in Austria was I went to the secretary, and she said, yes, you can see Professor so and so in 3 weeks. And I asked, is there any earlier opportunity? And she said no. So I just yanked out the keys and said, thank you, and resigned. That was it.
It's like sometimes it's like, I gotta do what I gotta do. My hand is forced here. And
I was a bit full of myself at that moment in time. I mean, you appreciate that, but I think it's not the way. This is not the way it works. You cannot just, this is dynamic. Questions pop up all the time. You can't just leave people, without answers for weeks. That's not how it works. I mean, if you're a postdoc level and you drive your own project, that's fine. I mean, I didn't want to see my PhD supervisor after my second year, more often than maybe once every 3 months or so. But at the beginning, you wanna have connectivity, because you have no confidence, you don't know what you're doing yet. So yeah,
absolutely. And that's not really a feedback loop either. It's like I guess it's like a 3-week feedback. You lob the question, and you're just like,
That's right. okay, what can you do? And at that moment in time, 3 weeks, like endless. It's just like,
Yeah. You're like your samples are going bad. You're like it's like I don't even know if I'll be able to, like, it's quite, by the time I get my answer, my samples are non-existent. So I don't even know.
moldy by that moment in that moment in time.
Yeah, and he's like, all right, well, I guess let's just scrap the whole project. um so you're now at Cambridge. There's a more dynamic kind of, it seems to be a more rapidly iterating feedback loop. And you've told your PI, you're like, hey, I actually would like to spend my time on my PhD in a different department. Can you talk a little bit about how the run up to that, to the lab that you and ultimately spent, your PhD in, and kind of the story and how that unfolded?
So that was pretty simple. Prof. Cox introduced me to Professor Blakemore at the vet school, and I went there. There was really a vet school in the middle of the green, cows and horses, and a shed where they were doing regenerative medicine research in the brain. And I kind of found that very cool. And so he had a chat with me and he said, well, there's this upcoming PI youngster, I'm not sure whether I have space, but why don't you talk to him? And that was Robin Franklin, who then became my PhD supervisor. So we connected. He said, yes, let's organize that. And actually, after a lot of paperwork and finishing my studies, I joined his lab, and the rest was history. It really was. It sounds simple, but it was simple at that moment in time.
That's amazing. And can you talk a little bit about that lab, and like, if you kind of like think about like what was the lab culture like, and what was it like to have him take you under his wing and mentor you?
So he again was early stage. He just started out his lab, and so I think he didn't quite know what to do with PhD students, and he wasn't older either. You see,
Yeah.
So we that was it was one of the first computer networks that we had access to. So what I remember is we were trying to always see whether he leaves the lab, and then we would sort of hijack the computers and play video game.
Yeah.
So that was great. Of course he knew, but he was fine with it. I think one of the things that I got a direct feedback loop from Robin immediately, and he's very thoughtful. He was very critical, but very thoughtful. And I think I had fantastic, very conventional training. So, hypothesis-driven research, really going all the way to the core, very rigorous. And I think that's what I learned from him. It was mainly in vivo work at that moment in time, some in vitro. And that combination again provides, opportunity that not often people have. And we were playing around with a precursor cell population or resident stem cell population in the brain, oligodendrocyte precursor cells. And that was also an opportunity that one didn't have so often. Stem cells weren't a thing yet, and so that together provided some unique opportunities for me, and I continued to be working in this field after I set up my own lab years later, of course. Until then, I pivoted into more the synthetic biology world that I'm sort of inhabiting at the moment.
That's amazing. I just can't emphasize enough how much I love how it just sometimes these things aren't planned. It's just like you just happen to be in an environment that afforded these kind of like rare opportunities.
Yes.
Because I was,
And I'm sure there would have been other opportunities because every choice you make closes other doors.
Yep.
So how do you navigate? And all you have is a sense what might be right or not, and often you don't really know. But if you have if you have a sense of your purpose, what you're trying to achieve, then you have a better chance of, getting there. And even though, for example, at that point in time, I didn't know whether I wanted to become a neurologist or whether I wanted to become a neurosurgeon. That was the least of my choices, by the way, or an ophthalmologist. I knew something around neuro, and I knew that it had to do with, serving other people and somehow making them better, and not only at the bedside, but also in the lab. So that was sort of clear at that moment in time. But the details weren't.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it just reminds me of what we're you touched on when you were deciding to move from math into medicine. And it was kind of that North Star, that guiding North Star. It's like, I want to help people. And then you let the kind of details kind of fill in themselves, but you kind of use that as your kind of navigation system. And it's interesting also, I love that you were hijacking the computers, because I was talking to David Baker at UW, and he had the exact same experience when he was doing his PhD. The campus had the computers, and they would just like go at night and just go hijack the computers.
Exactly. So we were playing, it wasn't a very nice game. It was a shooter game called Doom or so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's exactly it. It's the earliest days. And I think David Baker was saying the administration was like, you guys have to stop. Like, we know what's going on, but you're gonna have to stop.
Yeah. I mean, the good news is we're at the vet school, that it was pretty far from everywhere else.
That's all for this episode of the Biotech Startups podcast. We hope you enjoyed our conversation with Mark Kotter. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review, and share it with your friends. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to having you join us again for part 2 of our conversation with Mark. The Biotech Startups podcast is produced by Exceeder. Don't want to miss an episode? Search for the Biotech Startups podcast wherever you get your podcasts and click subscribe. Exceeder provides research labs with equipment leases on founder-friendly terms to support paths to exceptional outcomes. To learn more, visit our website www.exceeder.com. On behalf of the team here at Exceeder, thanks for listening. The Biotech Startups podcast provides general insights into the life science sector through the experiences of its guests. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from the podcast is at the user's own risk. The views expressed by the participants are their own and are not the views of Exceeder or sponsors. No reference to any product, service, or company in the podcast is an endorsement by Exceeder or its guests.